I never saw the blow coming. One second, my wife was asking my mother to stop making cruel jokes about her family background, and the next second there was a sound like a paddle hitting water. The sharp crack of my mother's hand connecting with my wife's cheek. Everything froze. I mean everything, the conversation, the breathing, the music that had been playing softly in the background. My mother stood there with her arms still extended, and I realized in that moment that something inside me had shifted, something fundamental and irreversible. Looking back now, I understand that wasn't the moment our family broke. That moment had been breaking for 23 years. I just didn't have the courage to admit it until my 6-year-old daughter asked me a question I couldn't answer. Let me start from the beginning of that Christmas season, because the real story didn't start with a slap. It started with wooden ornaments and a belief I was protecting my family by staying silent. Memphis in December can be cold, but not the kind of bitter cold that makes you gasp. It's the kind that creeps under your collar and settles into your bones without you noticing. My wife Rachel had been planning this Christmas for months. She and our daughter Sophie, only 6 years old at the time, a gift after years of believing children weren't in our future, spent entire evenings in our kitchen crafting ornaments. Small wooden shapes that Rachel had found at a craft store, painted with meticulous care. Little cardinals in deep crimson, snowflakes dusted with glitter, each one a small portrait of love that had cost almost nothing except time. Rachel had spent maybe $20 total on supplies, but the real investment was the hours. Every evening after dinner, I'd watch them at the kitchen table, Rachel's hands steady and patient as she guided Sophie's small fingers around a paintbrush. I knew what those ornaments meant. They weren't gifts because we were broke, though money was tight. It always is. They were gifts because Rachel believed that presence was more valuable than presence. That effort mattered more than expense. That a person who made something with their hands had given something irreplaceable. On Christmas Eve, we drove from Memphis to my mother's house in a neighborhood that had gotten steadily wealthier in the 15 years since I'd moved away. The homes were larger, the cars parked in driveways more expensive, the decorations more elaborate with each passing year. My mother's house sat at the end of a cul-de-sac, absolutely covered in white lights that made it look like something from a magazine photograph. If someone had driven past without knowing what was happening inside those walls, they would have assumed pure contentment lived there. Perfect family, perfect holiday, perfect tradition. I almost believed that myself. Sophie clutched the carefully wrapped package of ornaments the entire drive, turning it over and over in her small hands, checking and rechecking that the tissue paper hadn't torn. I could feel her nervous excitement. Rachel held her hand and smiled with that particular patience. She carried a patience that had been tested and refined over more than a decade of people not understanding her. My mother's sister was there when we arrived, along with my younger brother Marcus and his wife Diane. They'd already set their gifts under the tree. Coach bags, Nordstrom boxes, expensive department store logos everywhere. They were beautiful gifts, clearly chosen with thought, and they were also meant to communicate something about status, about having arrived somewhere my family hadn't. Diane noticed our brown paper bag immediately. It was wrapped with tissue paper and small green ribbons that Sophie had tied herself, some of the knots uneven, all of them genuine. "Oh," Diane said with a smile that stopped before it reached her eyes. "You two made gifts again." Sophie's face absolutely lit up. "We made everyone something." She couldn't contain her excitement. "Emily told me that you all really appreciate handmade things." I'm not sure where Emily came from. That wasn't my wife's name, but in that moment, I understood that Diane had already decided these gifts were somehow less than. Not less expensive, but less valuable, less respectable. The kind of thing people did when they couldn't afford real presents. My mother was pouring wine in the kitchen. I watched her face when she heard the exchange. Her expression didn't change, but something in the way she looked at the package told me she agreed with Diane. Completely. Totally. Without any question. She'd already made her judgment. That wasn't the first time I'd felt that judgment. Over the years, I'd grown accustomed to the small moments. A comment about Rachel's clothes, which came from thrift stores and off-season sales. A joke about where she'd grown up, told with enough lightness to seem affectionate but carrying just enough weight to leave a mark. A remark about her former job as a server, delivered with a particular kind of sympathy that made poverty sound like a disease she'd managed to recover from. Nothing loud enough to start a real conflict. Nothing substantial enough to justify making Christmas uncomfortable for everyone else. My mother was a master of the invisible wound. She could hurt someone so carefully that they almost seemed ungrateful for being upset about it. Every single time Rachel was hurt, she would find me later with that same patient smile and say something like, "I'm sure she didn't mean it that way," or "Your mom's from a different generation." She'd learned to swallow insults the way you learn to swallow pills, with a deep breath and the certainty that complaining only makes it worse. I'd learned to pretend I hadn't noticed. Looking back, I realized I hadn't been protecting the peace. I'd been protecting my mother from the consequences of her own words. Sophie tugged on Rachel's sleeve about 20 minutes before dinner. "Mom," she whispered. Rachel leaned down, and I watched my daughter's face cloud with confusion. Why didn't Aunt Diane like our ornament? Rachel did what she'd done 1,000 times before. She smoothed back Sophie's hair and said in that heartbreaking, patient voice, "Some people just show excitement differently, sweetheart." I wished more than anything that I believed that was true. Dinner was a performance of normalcy. We sat around my mother's formal dining room table, and the conversation drifted through the usual channels. Football, holiday travel plans, Marcus going on about needing to replace his Range Rover, Diane describing a vacation they'd booked to some resort in Mexico that cost more than Rachel and I made in 3 months combined. I sat there listening, watching my wife cut her food into smaller and smaller pieces, a nervous habit she had when she felt out of place. She was never out of place in her own character. She was brilliant and kind, and genuinely interested in people. But in that room full of people who measured themselves by what they owned and where they'd been, she somehow became smaller. And I let her. And I hated myself for letting her. Then Diane turned to Rachel, with something that looked almost playful, almost like she was telling a joke. "You know, I still can't believe David married someone from such a rough neighborhood. Your family's background is just so different from ours." A few nervous laughs floated around the table, the kind of laughter that everyone uses when something uncomfortable has been said and they need to pretend it was funny. Rachel set down her fork. The room seemed to get quieter, even though no one had stopped talking. "Diane," Rachel said, and her voice stayed absolutely calm. "Please stop. Just 2 words. Please stop." Not angry, not shaking, just clear. And that's when my mother's chair scraped backward, and I understood that something was about to happen that couldn't be taken back. I need to pause here because I want you to understand something about what happened next. I'm not trying to build dramatic tension or manipulate your emotions. I'm trying to help you feel what I felt in that moment, which was the sudden knowledge that the person I'd been trying to keep happy for my entire life had just made a choice about who she was. And it wasn't the choice I'd been expecting her to make. My mother walked across that dining room with such purpose, and I watched the arc of her hand as it moved toward Rachel's face. She didn't hesitate. She didn't seem angry even. She seemed like she was doing something necessary, something that had been waiting to happen for years. The sound was terrible. Not loud, just precise. A crack that echoed through the entire house. Everyone froze. Literally no one moved. No one spoke. The grandfather clock in the hallway kept ticking, and I could hear it like it was the only sound in the universe. Rachel didn't even raise her hand to her face. She just sat there, and I watched my mother stare down at her with the coldest expression I'd ever seen. "Your wife will never be anything else to this family," my mother said quietly. "She'll always be trailer trash." I was watching Sophie. She was watching her grandmother. And then she was watching me. Dad. That one word contained every question I'd failed to answer. Did Grandma kick us out because Mom's poor? No one spoke. Marcus looked stunned. Diane had folded her arms as if she'd won an argument. My mother waited for me to apologize to her, to explain that Rachel had started it, to smooth everything over and make it comfortable again. Instead, I knelt beside my daughter's chair, and I took both of her small hands in mine. I looked straight into her eyes, and I told her the only true thing I could think of in that moment. "No, sweetheart. Grandma forgot what kindness looks like." Sophie didn't fully understand what was happening, but something in her knew that this moment mattered. I stood up. Rachel's cheek was already beginning to show the outline of my mother's hand. The red mark was so clear, so obvious, so absolutely undeniable. "You okay?" I asked her quietly, And she nodded even though we both knew she wasn't okay and wouldn't be for a long time. I helped her into her coat. Sophie slipped her backpack over one shoulder without being asked, the way children do when they sense that adults have stopped making sense and it's time to be ready for anything. I noticed one of the ornaments had fallen beneath the edge of the dining table during the commotion. It had shattered. The cardinal, the one Sophie had painted herself, had broken into dozens of small pieces. I crouched down and carefully picked up every single piece, one by one, placing them gently back into the little wooden box we'd carried the ornaments in. Then I carried it to my truck. No goodbye, no shouting, no threats, just the sound of 3 people leaving a house that no longer felt safe. The drive back to Memphis felt like it took 6 hours, though it was probably only 90 minutes. Snow drifted across the highway in slow white ribbons. Sophie had fallen asleep before we even hit the interstate, her forehead pressed against the car window. Rachel didn't speak for almost the entire drive. She just stared out at the darkness, and I could see her reflection in the window, and I could see her trying very hard not to cry. Finally, almost 30 minutes from our house, she whispered something I'll never forget. "I'm sorry." Those 2 words broke something in me. I tightened my hands around the steering wheel, and I could feel my voice getting thicker, harder to control. "No," I said. "No, you're not. I'm the one who's sorry." She turned toward me, and even in the darkness of the car, I could see her looking at me with this expression of such complete loyalty, even after what had happened. "I spent 23 years asking you to be patient with my family. I should have been asking them to be better." She reached over and held my hand for the rest of the drive. I kept both hands on the wheel, and she just held my hand like she was anchoring me to something real, something true, something worth protecting. That night, after Sophie had fallen asleep on the couch under her favorite blanket, Rachel went upstairs to lie down. I walked into the garage where I kept my tools and boxes of old things. And beneath the metal cabinet where I stored my equipment was something I hadn't looked at in years. A worn envelope with my father's handwriting on the front. It had been sitting there since before Rachel and I were even married. My father had written me a letter years ago, before he passed away, and he'd asked me not to open it until I truly needed it. I pulled it out with shaking hands, and I unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. His handwriting was shaky. He'd written this letter near the end of his life, and the message was just one sentence. "One day you'll have to choose between keeping the peace and protecting your family." I read that sentence 3 times, then 4. Then I folded the letter carefully and put it back in the envelope. I already knew what he was trying to tell me. When I finally went inside, my phone was vibrating across the kitchen counter. My mother had called, then Kevin, then my mother again, then Diane. I turned the phone face down and went to bed. The next morning, fresh snow covered the backyard, and I made coffee while Sophie was still sleeping, and the coffee maker finished brewing, and I picked up my phone. 32 missed calls. 1 voicemail. My mother's name at the top of the screen. I pressed play. Her voice was shaking, almost broken. "David, please call me." I stood at the kitchen window, staring out at the untouched snow for what felt like an hour. For the first time in 23 years, I made a conscious decision. I did absolutely nothing. And I want to tell you that this was easy. It wasn't. I stood in my kitchen with a cold cup of coffee in my hands, and my mother's voicemail was playing over and over in my head. "David, please call me." 23 years of habit told me to grab my keys, get in my truck, and go fix whatever had broken. That's what I'd always done. Instead, I looked through the window at the backyard, and I watched Sophie come outside in her bright blue winter coat, and I watched her lie down in the snow to make an angel. Rachel appeared on the porch carrying 2 mugs of hot chocolate. They stood there laughing at something I couldn't hear, and I realized something that hit me like a physical blow. My family was only 3 people, just the 3 of us. Everything else was extra. Everything else was optional. The phone rang again. I turned it over without answering. By the 2nd day after Christmas, the calls had slowed down. By the 3rd day, instead of calls, there was a voicemail from Marcus. My voice sounded exhausted when he told me that my mother's furnace had stopped working. "She's freezing over here," he said. "It's supposed to drop below 0 tonight. Can you come fix it?" I knew that furnace. I'd installed the blower motor myself 4 winters ago. Every November, I went to my mother's house and cleaned the burners and replaced the filter and checked the ignition system. Not because anyone asked, but because if I didn't, no one else would. I understood my role perfectly. I was the person who made problems disappear. I deleted that voicemail. That afternoon, the weather report warned that temperatures would drop below zero overnight, and normally, I would have already been loading my truck with tools. Instead, I helped Sophie build something we'd started before Christmas, a treehouse bird feeder. We worked in the cold, and she painted tiny cardinals on the sides with her careful hand, while Rachel watched from the kitchen window with an expression on her face that I hadn't seen in years. It was peace. It was something like joy. Sophie tightened a crooked screw with the drill I was guiding her hands with, and she asked me a question that made me realize how much children understand about adult choices, even when adults don't understand themselves. "Dad, is Grandma still mad at us?" I set the drill down on the workbench. "I don't know. Are we mad?" "No." "Then why aren't we going to help her?" That question deserved a real answer, not a dismissal. I sat beside her on the workbench, and I took my time before I spoke. "Helping someone is a gift," I said. "It stopped." She thought about that. I could see her working through it, her small face serious and concentrated. "I think Mom always gave Grandma gifts." She did, and Grandma broke them. I looked back toward the house where Rachel was hanging bird seed ornaments on the fence, and I felt something shift inside my chest. "Sometimes," I said quietly, "people don't realize what they have until it isn't there anymore." That night, Marcus called 6 times. I didn't answer any of the calls. The following morning, the news showed the damage from the freeze. Frozen water pipes bursting all over Memphis, people losing heat, emergency plumbers charging thousands of dollars for emergency visits. My phone buzzed with another voicemail from Marcus. His voice sounded exhausted, defeated. "David, the basement at Mom's house flooded. The pipes burst right through the walls. We finally got a plumber. But because it's the holiday weekend, they're charging over $4,000. I knew exactly what had happened. The shutoff valve sat behind a storage shelf in my mother's utility room. I'd put a bright yellow tag on it years ago so someone would know where to find it quickly. Apparently, no one had ever bothered to notice. I closed the message without listening again. It hurt more than I expected, but not because of the furnace, and not because of the money. It hurt because every problem that arrived, and they kept arriving, one after another, was something I had already fixed, over and over, and no one except me had ever realized it was happening. Rachel noticed the weight that had settled on my face. "You can go fix it," she said. "I know you won't be weak if you do." I looked at her with this sudden clarity. I'm not choosing to stay here because I'm strong. I'm choosing to stay here because if I keep going back, I'm protecting the people who hurt you from having to face what they did. She walked over and took my hand. "I already chose you. I chose you a long time ago. I should have let that choice matter more years before this." That afternoon, we took Sophie sledding at a park on the edge of Memphis where the hills were perfect for a 6-year-old. She laughed so hard she could barely climb back up the slope. Halfway through the afternoon, she slipped her hand into mine, and she said something that will stay with me for the rest of my life. "I like this Christmas better." I stopped walking. "Even after what happened?" Sophie nodded. "Nobody yelled today." Those 4 words contained a devastating truth about what I had allowed to become normal in her childhood. I realized that my daughter was measuring happiness by the absence of conflict. No child should have to do that. Not ever. I picked her up and held her against my chest, and I promised her something I should have promised her years before. "We're never going to yell at you. We're never going to make you afraid. Grandma made a mistake, but we won't." By the second week of January, the missed calls had slowed considerably. Then an envelope arrived at my house. It was a property tax reminder for my mother's house. It had been forwarded to me because I'd been the one handling her paperwork for so many years, making sure nothing fell through the cracks. I placed it in a drawer without opening it. Not because I wanted my mother to lose her home, but because it wasn't mine to manage anymore. For the first time in 2 decades, everyone involved would have to face the consequences of their choices. For the first time, everyone would have to grow up. A few days later, I was replacing a loose cabinet hinge in my kitchen when someone pounded on the front door hard enough to rattle the glass. It was Marcus. He looked older than I'd ever seen him, like something had been draining him. "You've got some nerve," he said when I opened the door. I didn't invite him inside, but I also didn't close the door in his face. "Morning," I said. He didn't return the greeting. "Mom's house is falling apart. She's drowning in paperwork. Tax bills are piling up. The plumbing repairs are going to be huge, and you're acting like none of this is your problem." "I didn't make her slap my wife," I said quietly. "You know that's not what this is about," he snapped back. "No," I answered calmly. "I think it is." He rubbed both hands across his face, and I could see that he was genuinely frustrated. "You've always handled this stuff." "I know. So fix it." The words hung between us like they were physical objects. For 23 years, those words would have worked. They would have activated something inside me that made me move, that made me fix, that made me sacrifice. Not anymore. "I can't," I said. His frustration turned into disbelief. "You can't?" "No. You mean you won't?" I didn't correct him, because the distinction didn't matter anymore. Marcus stared at me for several long seconds, then he shook his head. "I don't even know where to start." For the first time, I believed him completely. He truly didn't know because he'd never been required to. I glanced toward the basement door. Behind it sat a worn cardboard file box that I'd filled over the years with every receipt, every repair invoice, every tax payment, every insurance renewal, every doctor's appointment, everything no one else had bothered to notice. I looked back at Marcus. "Maybe," I said quietly. "It's finally time you learned where to start." Marcus stood on my front porch for almost a full minute after I mentioned the file box. He looked past me toward the basement door. "What file box?" "The one that explains why you don't know where to start." He frowned deeply. "I don't need a lecture, David. I wasn't planning on giving you one." Part of me wanted to close the door. Part of me wanted to leave him standing on the porch with his confusion and his frustration. But another part of me remembered all the years I'd kept quiet because I thought silence was kindness. It wasn't. It was just silence. "Come inside," I said. Rachel looked up from the kitchen when Marcus walked in. She didn't say a word. She simply nodded politely before disappearing upstairs to help Sophie with her homework. I watched Marcus's eyes as he looked at my wife. The outline of the slap was barely visible now, just a slight discoloration if you knew where to look. He lowered his eyes. "I didn't know Mom would." "I know." "No." He swallowed hard. "I really didn't." I believed him. That didn't erase what happened. It only explained part of it. I opened the basement door and walked downstairs. The file box sat exactly where I'd left it, tucked beneath the workbench beside old paint cans and Christmas decorations stacked from years of holidays. It wasn't anything special, just a faded cardboard storage box with black marker across the side. My house. I carried it upstairs and set it on the dining room table. Marcus laughed once in absolute disbelief. "You've got to be kidding." "I'm not." He lifted the lid carefully. Inside were folder after folder, each one labeled with a year. 2012, 2013, 2014, all the way to the present. He pulled out the first one. Stacks of receipts, property taxes. I nodded. "You paid these when Mom's pension came up short." He opened another folder. Roof repairs. Then another. Furnace maintenance. Another. Home insurance renewals. Prescription copays. Water heater replacement. Snow removal. Tree trimming. Hospital parking receipts. Gas station receipts from dozens of trips to Memphis Methodist Hospital, where my mother had her medical appointments. Marcus stopped flipping through the pages. His voice became quieter with each folder he opened. "I don't understand." I said. "You weren't supposed to." "What do you mean?" He was still staring at the folders. "Every time your mother thanked me," I said, "you were usually the person she was thanking." He sat down heavily. The room suddenly felt very small. I thought she handled all this herself. So did she. He looked confused. "What?" "I never wanted Mom to feel like a burden, so you let her believe everything somehow worked itself out." Silence settled between us. Finally, Marcus whispered something that confirmed he was finally understanding. "How much?" I leaned back. "I stopped adding it up years ago." "No." His eyes stayed on the receipts. Tell me. I hesitated. Over $80,000. His head snapped up. What? Spread over 12 years. 80,000 give or take. He ran both hands through his hair. I had no idea. I know. He picked up another folder. Inside was a spiral notebook. What is this? My maintenance log. He opened a random page and saw dates and parts and costs and notes. January 9th. Cleaned burners before winter storm. March 18th. Replaced leaking shutoff valve. October 27th. Checked roof flashing after wind damage. Every page looked the same. No complaints. Just work. Marcus slowly closed the notebook. I could see him calculating something in his head. You came over about once a week. His face went pale. I lived 20 minutes away. I didn't answer because there wasn't anything left to say. At that moment, Diane walked through the front door without knocking. She knew Marcus's truck was there. What's all this? She looked at the table and the folders and the file box. Kevin didn't answer. She picked up a receipt and then another. Oh, please. She rolled her eyes. So, you kept records? I always do. She folded her arms. You're still his son. Children are supposed to help their parents. I nodded once. They are. There's a difference, I said gently, between choosing to help someone and having them believe they're entitled to it. She scoffed. Sounds like the same thing to me. No. I met her eyes. It isn't. The room fell quiet again. Marcus looked from me to Diane and then back at the file box. His shoulders seemed to sink another inch. You never asked for a single dollar. No. You never even mentioned it. No. Why? I smiled without humor. Because I thought that's what family did. He looked like someone had punched him. I should have helped. You should have known. Before either of us could say anything else, my phone buzzed. The caller ID read Richard Lawson, our family's attorney. I excused myself and stepped into the hallway. David. Richard's voice sounded measured as always. I met with your mother this morning. I closed my eyes. I figured she would call you eventually. She has questions about the trust documents. I expected that. There was a pause. She's considering challenging some of your decisions as successor trustee. I almost laughed. What decisions exactly? He sighed. I told her you haven't exercised any extraordinary authority. In fact, you've gone beyond what the trust requires. I leaned against the wall. Did she believe you? Not yet. Another pause. David. Yeah, I've represented your family for almost 20 years. I know. I've rarely seen someone do more than the trust required. I looked toward the dining room where Marcus was still sitting there surrounded by 12 years of paperwork. Diane had stopped talking for once. Richard spoke again. I think it's time everyone understands why your father appointed you. After we hung up, I stood there in the hallway for a long moment. My father hadn't only left me responsibility, he'd left me something else. Permission. Permission to stop confusing sacrifice with love. Permission to stop bleeding for people who didn't deserve it. When I walked back into the dining room, Marcus looked up. What now? I looked at the file box, then at my brother. Now, I said quietly, you learned something our father never wanted either of us to forget. I turned toward the old cabinet in the corner of the living room. Inside, behind a stack of photo albums and old pictures, lay that worn envelope with my father's handwriting on the front. I had carried its words alone for years. Maybe it wasn't mine to carry anymore. I didn't open the envelope that afternoon. I simply rested my hand on it. Not yet, I said. Marcus looked confused. I thought you said Dad wanted us to know. He did. I slid the envelope back into the cabinet. But there are still some things you need to see first. The next morning, I drove to Richard Lawson's office in downtown Memphis. The city was cold and gray, and I didn't want to go. After everything that happened at Christmas, the last thing I wanted was another confrontation with my own family. Richard greeted me with the same calm handshake he'd used for 20 years. His office overlooked the Mississippi River, and he'd helped my parents prepare their estate plan after my father was diagnosed with heart disease. He knew every page of that trust document better than anyone alive. Margaret is here, he said quietly when I arrived. I figured that, and Diane insisted on coming. That didn't surprise me either. Richard led me into the conference room. My mother looked older than she had 3 weeks earlier. The confidence that usually filled any room whenever she entered was completely gone. She looked smaller, worn down. Diane, on the other hand, still carried herself like someone expecting to win an argument. She barely acknowledged me when I sat down. Richard closed the door. A thick binder sat in front of him. "So," he began, "I've reviewed every document related to your family trust." Diane leaned forward. "Good." Richard ignored the interruption. "I've also reviewed the financial records David voluntarily provided." He opened the binder, property tax payments. He turned to Hall Gem. Insurance premiums. Another. Roof repairs. Another. Furnace maintenance. Medical transportation. Prescription assistance. Emergency plumbing. Electrical work. Page after page after page. The room became quieter with every document he turned. Finally, Richard closed the binder. "I have reached one clear conclusion." Everyone waited. He looked directly at my mother. "David has done substantially more than the trust required." Diane crossed her arms. So Richard didn't even glance at her. "The trust obligated him to manage the property responsibly." He paused. "It never required him to spend his own retirement savings maintaining your lifestyle." My mother blinked. "What do you mean?" Richard folded his hands. "The trust protects your right to live in the house." "Yes, it does not require David to personally pay expenses that exceeded your available income." Silence filled the room. If David had acted strictly as trustee, he let the sentence hang for a moment, he would have recommended selling the property years ago. My mother's face lost its color. "What?" "The maintenance costs, taxes, insurance, and emergency repairs exceeded what the house could reasonably sustain." Richard looked at me briefly before continuing. Instead, David quietly absorbed those costs himself. Denise finally spoke. "Well, that's what family does." Richard looked at her for the first time. "No." His voice remained polite, but firm. "Family helps because they choose to." He closed the binder. Entitlement is something entirely different. Nobody argued, not even Diane. My mother stared at the polished wooden table. I didn't know. I believed her. She truly hadn't known. That somehow made everything sadder. Richard reached for another folder. "There's one more matter." He slid a copy of the trust toward my mother. "Your husband selected David as successor trustee because he believed David would make careful, compassionate decisions." My mother slowly looked up. So Harold knew. He knew David's character. Richard smiled gently, and after reviewing 12 years of records, he looked toward me. "I'd say he chose wisely." No one spoke for several seconds. Finally, Diane pushed back her chair. "So that's it?" Richard nodded. "There is no legal claim against David, and if you filed one anyway, it would almost certainly fail." She looked frustrated, but she had nothing left to say. The meeting ended quietly. No dramatic shouting, no victory speeches. Just people standing up one by one, carrying truths that suddenly felt much heavier than they had an hour earlier. Outside in the parking lot, Marcus caught up with me. "I owe you an apology." "You don't owe me anything today." "I do." He rubbed the back of his neck. "I kept thinking Mom depended on the house." I looked at him. "Turns out she depended on you." I smiled faintly. "No, she depended on the version of me that never said no." He nodded slowly. "I don't think I ever really saw everything you were doing. I made sure you didn't." We stood there for another minute before going our separate ways. I drove back to Memphis in silence, thinking about what it means to finally be seen, and about the cost of being invisible. Life settled into an unfamiliar rhythm after that. The phone stopped ringing every day. Rachel laughed more. Sophie stopped asking whether Grandma hated us. Instead, she started talking about school again. One Saturday afternoon, she came running into the garage while I was organizing old tools. "Dad," she waved a sheet of paper over her head. "I won." "What did you win?" "My ornament." She handed me the letter. Her elementary school had held a winter arts competition before Christmas break. The judging had been delayed because of the holidays. Now, the results had finally arrived. First place for the same hand-painted cardinal ornament that Diane had laughed at. Rachel read the letter twice before smiling with pride. "I'm so proud of you." Lily looked up at her. "Do you think Grandma would like it now?" Rachel hesitated. Then she knelt beside her. "I hope one day she'll understand why it mattered." That answer stayed with me. Not because it guaranteed anything, but because Rachel still hoped, even after everything. Spring slowly replaced winter. The snow disappeared. The trees turned green again. Life became quieter than it had been in years. One evening, while I was grilling burgers in the backyard, Marcus called. His voice sounded different, tired. "Mom wants me to ask you something." I waited. "She wants to know if she could see Sophie." I looked through the kitchen window. Rachel and Sophie were making lemonade together, laughing over something that had spilled across the counter. The sight filled me with both peace and caution. "I'll think about it. She knows she doesn't deserve it." "I know." A long silence followed. Then Marcus said something I never expected to hear. "David, yeah, I think she's finally starting to understand what she really lost that night." After we hung up, I stood alone in the backyard until the sun dipped below the trees. A few days later, an envelope arrived in our mailbox. The handwriting on the front was unmistakable. Margaret. Inside was a single sheet of paper. There was no excuse, no explanation, just one handwritten sentence. "If you'll let me, I'd like to come to your 4th of July cookout." I folded the note carefully and slipped it back into the envelope. For a long time, I simply stared at it. Some wounds heal quickly. Others need more than an apology. And some decisions can't be made by the person who was hurt the least. I looked through the window toward Sophie. If anyone deserved to decide what happened next, it wasn't me. The 4th of July arrived warmer than anyone had predicted. By noon, the backyard smelled like charcoal and fresh-cut grass, and Rachel's homemade potato salad. Sophie ran through the sprinkler with 2 girls from next door, laughing so hard she nearly slipped across the wet lawn. Every few minutes, she'd stop just long enough to check whether the burgers were ready before running off again. Watching her laugh without looking over her shoulder every few seconds was something I still wasn't used to. Peace had become unfamiliar. Marcus showed up first. He carried a bowl of baked beans and looked awkward standing at the gate. "You sure this is okay?" he asked. "I invited you." I wasn't talking about me. I knew exactly what he meant. Before I could answer, another car slowly pulled into the driveway. My mother climbed out by herself. She looked smaller than I remembered. Not physically, just older, more fragile. She wasn't wearing the expensive jewelry she usually wore to family gatherings. No perfectly styled hair, no carefully chosen holiday outfit, just a simple blue blouse and comfortable shoes. In her hands was a small gift box wrapped in plain brown paper. For a moment, nobody moved. Rachel quietly reached for my hand. I squeezed hers once. "It's your call," she whispered. "No," I said softly. "It's ours." My mother walked across the yard one careful step at a time. When she reached us, she didn't try to hug anyone. She didn't even look at me first. She looked at Rachel. "I owe you something I've never given you," she said quietly. Rachel waited. "My respect." The words hung in the warm summer air. My mother took a slow breath. "I've practiced this speech for weeks," she said. She glanced around the backyard. "Would everyone mind if I said it now?" Nobody objected. Marcus quietly pulled out a chair for her. She didn't sit. Instead, she stood in front of all of us, unfolding a single sheet of paper from her pocket. Her hands trembled. "I spent most of my life pretending I came from somewhere better than I did." She looked toward the ground. "My father drank away almost everything we had." She smiled sadly. "We lived in a trailer for years." Rachel looked surprised. So did Marcus. I hated it. My mother's voice cracked. "I promised myself I'd never be poor again." She paused. "Somewhere along the way, I stopped fearing poverty." She looked at Rachel. "I started fearing people who reminded me of it." Silence settled over the backyard. "I judged you before I ever knew you," she continued. "I convinced myself that where you grew up mattered more than the kind of woman you became." She wiped at one eye. "When Diane made jokes, I should have stopped her. Instead, I joined her. Her eyes finally met Rachel's. The slap. She closed her eyes for a second. Is something I will regret for the rest of my life. Rachel didn't speak. My mother turned toward Sophie. I also hurt someone who had done nothing except love her grandmother. Sophie instinctively stepped a little closer to Rachel. I understand if you never forgive me, my mother said. She slowly held out the little gift box. I brought something. She handed it to Rachel. Rachel looked at me. I nodded. She carefully untied the ribbon. Inside lay a Christmas ornament. The little wooden cardinal. Sophie gasped. That's mine. It was. The paint had been touched up, the ribbon replaced. The crack was still there if you looked closely. My mother noticed Sophie tracing it with one finger. I couldn't make it perfect again. Her voice barely rose above a whisper, but I picked up every piece after you left. Rachel looked at her. You kept it. My mother nodded. Every piece. She smiled through tears. I thought if I could fix the ornament, maybe someday I'd learn how to fix what I broke. Nobody rushed to fill the silence. Some moments deserve quiet. Sophie looked up at me. Dad? I knelt beside her just like I had 6 months earlier on Christmas Eve. Yes, sweetheart. She glanced toward her grandmother. Are you still mad? I smiled gently. How I feel isn't the most important thing right now. She frowned. It isn't. I shook my head. You were hurt too. She looked back at my mother, then at Rachel, finally at me again. What happens now? I rested a hand lightly on her shoulder. That decision belongs to you. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she walked slowly across the yard. My mother stayed exactly where she was. She didn't reach out, didn't ask for forgiveness, didn't even speak. Sophie stopped in front of her. My ornament isn't perfect anymore. My mother nodded. I know. Sophie smiled just a little. Neither is our family. Then she wrapped both arms around her grandmother. My mother quietly cried into Sophie's shoulder. Rachel leaned against me. I wasn't expecting that. Neither was I. A few minutes later, everyone finally sat down to eat. The conversation wasn't loud or forced. It was simply careful. And somehow that felt more honest than all the fake smiles we'd shared over the years. After dinner, Marcus helped me clean the grill. I'm sorry, he said quietly. I should have carried more of the load. You can start now. He nodded. I will. For the first time, I believed him completely. As the sun began to set, my mother walked over one last time. I don't expect things to go back to the way they were. They won't, I answered honestly. She lowered her head. I know. We'll visit, she said. Hopefully. She looked up. There are going to be boundaries. I understand. No insults. She continued. There won't be. No comments about Rachel. Never again. And if Sophie ever feels unwelcome? My mother finished the sentence herself. You'll leave. Yes. She smiled sadly. I would too. When she drove away that evening, I realized something surprising. I didn't feel like I'd won because this had never really been about winning. It was about finally choosing the people who had quietly chosen me every single day. Later that night, after the fireworks faded and Sophie had fallen asleep with her repaired ornament sitting on her bedside table, Rachel and I sat together on the back porch. She rested her head against my shoulder. You know, she said, your dad was right. I smiled. He usually was. He told you to protect your family. I looked through the window toward Sophie's room. I finally did. And I want to say something to whoever's watching this right now. The strange thing about boundaries is that they don't always push people away. Sometimes they become the only bridge strong enough to rebuild a relationship the right way. If there's one lesson this experience taught me, it's that love should never require you to sacrifice your family's dignity. The people who truly love you will eventually learn to respect your boundaries, or they'll show you why those boundaries were necessary in the first place. If this story reminded you of someone in your own life, I'm grateful you spent this time with me. And if you've ever had to choose between keeping the peace and protecting the people you love, I hope you know you're not alone. You're not the only person who had to learn that saying no isn't selfish, it's survival. So here's what I need from you. In the comments, tell me this. Are you in a situation where you're still keeping the peace when you should be protecting someone you love? Comment 1 if you're still figuring it out. Comment 2 if you've already made the hard choice. Comment 3 if you're just starting to realize this is something you need to do. I want to know where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. And if you have a story like this, if you've ever had to set a boundary with someone you love, I want to hear it. Share it with me in the comments. Let's build a community of people who understand that protecting your family isn't betrayal, it's love. If this story resonated with you, please subscribe. I'm putting out stories every week about the moments when ordinary people finally choose themselves and the people who matter most. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening.